Hello and welcome to Varnblog, and today we continue our engagement with Raymond Geuss's Not Thinking Like a Liberal. We are now in chapter 3. We skipped ahead a little bit, and we're going to be on the section 3 Senses of Authority from the chapter Authoritarianism. Now, I'll summarize some of what is discussed in the prior section. There's a discussion more about the relationship between Catholicism and liberalism, and both Thomistic and non-Thomistic branches of Catholicism. I didn't so much go through the theological discussions in here because Geuss is using this to set up as a way to talk about Marxism, but we should dig into this a little bit. He asserts that his Catholic upbringing, even though it was anti-liberal, was not actually authoritarian, even though it was committed to absolute transcendental truths, as formulated by dogmata, or dogma. So let's get into this a little bit, and we'll talk about the 3 senses of authority. 3 senses of authority. This is from Geuss again. Rather than trying to define authoritarianism, an enterprise even more hopeless than trying to define liberalism, let me cite the formula which is most characteristic of that. You ought, or you should, or you ought to do this just because I say so. It is important to note from the start that this is a distinct from another formula with which it is sometimes associated and often confused. You must do this or else. Emphasis in the original. Which is a formula not of authority but of pure power. The distinction between the two things can be seen most easily if one compares the actions of a thug or of kidnappers with that of a policeman in a highly legally regulated society. Kidnappers may simply overpower me on the street, tie me up, bundle me off without necessarily saying a word. They may not even speak my language. They simply force me to do what they want, and do not necessarily even make any claim that I ought to do what they want. They don't even claim that they have any kind of authority. In contrast, the policeman has both a club and a warrant. If he tells you to break up a demonstration and go home, he may threaten you with his club, but he also claims to be acting on warrant and with authority. He does not just force you. He claims that you ought to obey. The warrant may be false, the claim baseless, the reality may be just the club, but to discuss authority at all is to imagine that there is a difference between simply hitting someone with a club and claiming someone ought to do something as policeman says. This is Varn talking. I don't know that distinction is as substantive as that, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt here. The club's still involved. And in fact, the club's why the authority has any force. Back to Geuss. Understanding authority means understanding exactly in what sense should or ought is being used in the formula. You should or ought to do this just because I say so. And we have a footnote, so let's go look at that footnote. I eventually wrote a paper on response to this invitation by Martin Bauer, translated as Authority, Some Fables, and a World Without Why, Princeton University. I have that book, so we might go to that one day. We come back to this to kind of supplement our reading of Geuss. But until then, so Geuss is saying the claim that you should or ought because something is said is different than you have to because I have stick. Even though the stick's implied in both cases. But one is a legitimate use of the stick, saying that the stick comes with some kind of authority, whereas the other is just pure force. The difference might be semantic, but it's semantic that has a lot of importance when we talk about like civil law. All right. So, in what way and to what extent did Catholicism I encountered during my youth instantiate the formula for authoritarianism? Let me start with my experience in the local parish where my family attended Mass every Sunday. Another part of the fate prepared for me that I succeeded very effectively in avoiding and is summed up in the name of the church, the Church of St. Joseph the Worker. This name is a giveaway. Most members of the parish were workers in the local steel mill and various associated plants. And the dedication to St. Joseph, specifically in his function as a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, was repeatedly cited in sermons. This is Varn talking. You have to deal with this when we talk about like Catholic workers' movement, liberation theology, and whatnot, because this is more integrated in Catholicism for a variety of reasons, including the kind of integralist or corporatist part of Catholic social thought, where all roles of society have a dignity, they're all ordained by God, and they're all necessary. So the role of keeping the polis together, or keeping the political community together, is done through the idea that everyone has their due dignity in place in the system, and that's why certain myths, like the myth of chivalry and stuff, are evoked. Well, we mostly know that this stuff was never actually practiced, but it was used as a social model. Anyway, and there's less of that in Protestantism for kind of obvious reasons. See Max Weber. All right, go back to this. And this is Geuss again. The role we were fated to play in the economy was indicated and sacralized. The sermons also very frequently took the form of a description of what we now probably call some personal or social issue, which was evoked in lurid terms before the resounding conclusion, "This is how you should act because the Pope says so." This was not the beginning of some kind of interpretive or argumentative process, but rather the citation was itself considered to end the discussion definitively. The idea parishioner then was laborans et obediens, are dutiful, are laborious and obedient. Translate from very easy Latin. Anyway, back to Geuss. In general, authoritarian tendency of the Catholic Church in the United States, at any rate in the 1950s, was not then simply a myth. And for that matter, one might even extend this generalization to the church as a whole since the Counter-Reformation. Still, this was not the whole story of the version of Catholicism I encountered in my school. First of all, some of my teachers mounted a constant and unremitting theoretical assault on authority as a concept. In the religious class, Kriegler, I believe he was a parish priest and his teacher, discussed the general idea of authority and its role in religion. He explained that in English, authority was used in three ways. First, it was used in the cognitive context as a term to designate a high degree of epistemic competence in a particular field. We might call that authority or mastery over a subject. You have the authority to teach, you have the authority to do medicine, etc. That's me adding that, by the way. Back to Geuss. Mark is an authority on the diseases of liver. It means he knows a lot about them, and that consequently his judgment is reliable. If Mark knows a good bit about the liver, then under most circumstances it would be a good idea that it's highly advisable to listen to what he says if one's concern is the liver. Such knowledge gives Mark no power to coerce you in any way, nor should it reasonably generate in him the expectation that you would necessarily do what he says. It certainly does not in and of itself impose upon you any obligation to do what he recommends. Equally, I may recognize that Mark has a special epistemic competence and realize that it would be perfectly rational to do as he says, but feel no inclination to do what he proposes. Finally, certainly, one cannot expect to give me orders about what to do about my liver just on the basis of his expertise. Fair enough. The second use of the term authority was an expression like Jane has natural authority, just to be seen parallel to Max Weber's idea of charisma. Weber coined this concept in order to describe a form of political organization which the biblical texts describe as being prevalent before the monarchy. There was no king. People followed a series of judges. This is in quotation marks. Judge here means something different in Hebrew. Such a judge was a figure who could get many people to follow his, or in some cases her, lead voluntarily, or at any rate pay attention to and take seriously what he or she said and proposed, just by the force of some unique qualities of personality, or because of a striking constellation of unexpected successes, or a combination of both. Natural authority had to be visible and palpable, a person who looked like someone whose lead one would want to follow. See footnote 3. I had direct experience of this in the mid-70s. When one of my cousins was a policeman in Philadelphia and decided that he wished to move to New York, he asked me to inquire about employment in the New York City Police Department. At the time, I had shoulder-length hair and a general appearance was both unathletic and informal. In the face of the cops in the precinct office, as I explained to them that I wanted an application form to join NYPD, indicated to me that they had a clear conception, to which I did not conform, of the appearance of a policeman, which should have in order to project a sense of natural authority. The Greeks had no difficulty with the first concept of authority, that which belongs to the expert. Ho empirikos, or ho epistemon. I don't know Greek, so I probably butchered that. Although Weber used the Greek word charisma for the concept, naming natural authority, the Greeks themselves did not really use that word in the specific sense, but had a battery of different ways of describing the phenomenon in question, often in terms derived from the polydynamic and polytheistic religious experience. So one found various variants of he spoke like God, or like Orpheus, he enchanted them. In general, Krieger said, the Greeks were a population that were very open to be amazed, surprised, thunderstruck, but they were also highly fractious and very disinclined to obey one another voluntarily or not. The economy that this caused naturally to them was to be persuaded or be forced. And this did not leave much room for such things as natural authority. So if you did find that you had to describe it, you reached for metaphors or similes for magic, religious experience, or intoxication. The third concept of authority, normative authority, is one that has become historically the most important and is still central to our way of thinking. The sense in which, in modern societies, people are supposed to think that they should follow duly issued government regulations, or they ought to do what the policeman says. Authority in this sense completely baffled the Greeks. They did not even have a word for it. They knew about power, force, domination, and rule. They understood these all very well, Klugler said. Also persuasion, respect, permission, ability, and any number of other related phenomena. But authority, autoritas, was specifically a Roman political concept, which was so deeply connected with particular Roman institutions, habits, and ideas that it couldn't be easily extracted from these, even after the Eastern Mediterranean became part of the Roman Empire. The Greeks themselves had trouble with the concept because they had no equivalent. Even later scholars had trouble with the very idea of authoritas. All right. So let me look at the footnote again. Footnote. The great Roman historian Theodore Mommsen said that authoritatis was inherently a fuzzy concept. Verswan Vomen, and that it resisted strict definition. Einzig aller strengten definition einzigendes wird. Theodore Mommsen. He writes that authoritatis is more than a piece of advice, but less than an order. And mir alles in Reichsflag in wenig in weniger alles in Bifo. Apologize to my German speakers. My German has My German pronunciation has completely collapsed after 25 years. Anyway, particularly the vowels. So basically, Geuss is arguing that his teacher told him that the Greeks didn't really have a concept of authority, and that specifically the Roman concept was a little bit fuzzier than ours, but it was very much attached to Roman institutions and not so much familiar to Greek ones. This was what I heard in a class in about 1959, 1960, and it was only almost 50 years later, in about 2008, when I happened to be reading the history book by Dio Cassio, a Greek-speaking Roman senator, that I found the actual passage Krieger was probably had in mind. In discussing the events in Roman history, Dio Cassio explicitly writes that there is a Roman use in the political context, authoritatis, for which there is no Greek equivalent, och instant Helitzen. It is impossible not to Hellenize this or to put the word into Greek. It is worth dwelling on this point. What Dio is saying is not that the ancient Greeks did not have a word for authoritas, but in a way in which it lacked a word for tea, coconut, or kangaroo. There's no word for kangaroo because the Greeks never encountered one, but the relevant conceptual space for the word is there. The idea of having a noun for a particular kind of animal was perfectly available to them, and all they would have to do was to associate the animal with a sound or some visual marks. In the case of authority, I'm just going to translate the one word, are auctoritas. You can tell I read a lot more languages than I speak. I apologize for that. What is lacking is the word, but the whole set of conceptions associated with the use of this word, which gave it its meaning. A parallel formation to Hellenitzin to Meditzin to mediaize, which doesn't necessarily mean to speak Persian, but to adopt Persian dress, manners, and customs, take the political part of the Persians, are to think and act like a Persian. Similarly, you can Hellenize this means authoritas expresses something that cannot be incorporated. You can't Hellenize this means authoritas expresses something that cannot be incorporated or assimilated into the way a Greek thinks about things. That's an interesting concept. That's me talking. Of course, you can try to change the way the Greeks thinks about things, expand what they can imagine, say, to re-educate them. And by the time Dio wrote, the Romans had several centuries to try to do that by forcing them to live with some Roman institutions. No internal restructuring of the Greek way of thought about things would be necessary to make a kangaroo Greek, to show them one and give them a word for it. The Romans... That makes the Romans' apparent lack of success in imposing some of their consumptions on the Greeks only more striking. Dio does finally explain at some length what the word means, and in the end, not very well, in fact. The best he can do is point to the monoglottal Greek reader in more or less the right direction. One could, of course, speculate the reason why the Greeks had such difficulty with the third concept of authority, that for them the exercise of power was characteristically personal and immediate. Their idea of power of the people and democracy is that the people really do various things. They don't just elect representatives to do them. Equally, their experience and knowledge or expertise was highly personal. The locus of it was a particular concrete person, not an encyclopedia, not an anonymous university board of examiners or a medical association or some kind of trace on a computer system. This made it hard for them to imagine an abstract structure as the locus of authority. But this, however, is no more than speculation. So if we look at the word authority here, we actually find something interesting. This almost fits the Hegel-Marx pattern of like how things develop. You have first the concrete expertise of a person, so they have the authority to speak and give you advice. You have a second, a slightly more nebulous but still personalized kind of authority, so you project the right kind of character, etc. In classical Greek rhetoric, we might call this ethos. Like ethos is your credibility as a person, your charisma. Charisma wasn't used that way in Greek, apparently. And I think I did know that, actually. And then lastly, there's this abstract authority. So we move from the concrete particular to a concrete nebulous to an abstract, structural, and institutionalized kind of authority. So instead of, in democracy, you elect people and everybody does things to do that, and there's sortition and etc. And in the Roman Republic, people represent you and have authority to act for you and have authority to force you to do things. Now, this concept of authority and who lacks and who has it is going to be tied into sovereignty and a bunch of other things. And you see that here at the end. And, going back to ancient Greek thinking is useful. I find it a little strange to say that the Greeks had no concept of abstract authority in a way that is different from saying they had no concept of a kangaroo. But it's awfully close to Sapphire Warfish thought. But I do see the possibility that this idea of institutions being able to bestow things abstractly on any individual, and the institution itself being the source of authority, not the individual's own power or capability, would kind of probably be a leap for a lot of societies. Now, we'll get back into this when we get to the second part of this chapter, but I think that's interesting to think about when you think about what authoritarianism is. We often associate authoritarianism with natural authority, like with demagoguery or something like that, or a sovereign exception, right? But what may actually be here is more interesting. If we take the third definition that Geuss posits as the one that we base authoritarianism in, which is the idea of abstract and mitigated authority, perhaps not everything demagogical would be authoritarian. So something to think about as we move on. We're going to read a lot of this chapter because I find this discussion of authority very helpful for understanding differences between other forms of political thought and liberalism, and then people who are like transcendental figures like, say, Thomas Hobbes or Diderot, or maybe even J.S. Mill, who Geuss says is not truly liberal, which I find interesting. And I don't normally think that, but we'll get into that as we go on. Thank you so much. Like and subscribe. There are additional radical engagements on the Patreon in addition to monthly Q&As most months. Usually I try to do 2 a month. And patron-only shows, etc. Most things, however, are available for free here, and a few months later on the public podcast feed. If you want the interviews more timely or audio only of stuff like this, then you need to be a patron as well. Thank you so much and have a great day. Please leave a comment, hit the bell, do what you do.